first question is the hardest. You need to tell me your name and what your unit was. What your name, rank, and unit.
Um, Richard Syracuse, First Lieutenant, platoon leader of the 4th Platoon of the 31st, 32nd Signal Company Special.
Okay. Are you unwrapping a candy back there? Okay. How did you get into the Army? How did you get into the 23rd?
Man, that's a story. I was called to active duty as a chemical warfare officer after having received a second lieutenancy through ROTC in the infantry. And the Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that as a chemical engineering student, I would be better served the military in the chemical warfare. I joined the chemical. I reported to duty in June of 1942, and I don't know. I was at Edgewood Arsenal maybe for about 6 weeks, and to my amazement, I was ordered to take a cadre and form a company at Camp Landing, Florida, chemical smoke generator company. And to my amazement, when I met my cadre, these were the non-commissioned officers, First Sergeant on down to Corporal 14. I discovered they were a colored group, and we used the word colored at that time, and we didn't use the word black. I was somewhat pleased at the unusual responsibility I was being handed, fully unaware of what I faced in the South as an officer commanding a black unit. And the trials and tribulations, you might call them, occurred very quickly. The night that we left, myself and 2 other officers with their cadres to report to Camp Landing, Florida, we took a regular train out of Edgewood, and the agreement with the conductor was that we would wait until the civilians had eaten, and then the 3 officers and 42 enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, would then go down to the dining car and have dinner. We had meal tickets, as they call them. Typical traditional Army method of doing things when there was a small group of organized troops moving. Well, we entered the dining car, and the 3 officers naturally sat down at a table. The first sergeant sat down at their table, and and they were organizing themselves in rank. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw the dining room conductor busying himself with a white sheet, and he was hanging the white sheet up between us and the troops, the men. And I politely asked him what he thought he was doing. He said, "Well, son," he says, we just passed the Mason-Dixon line, and in the South, he said, white folks don't eat with black folks. So I said, "Well, you may be making a mistake here, sir." I said, "We is not white folks and black folks." He says, "We are members of the United States Army. These are soldiers in the Army, and we are officers, and we eat with our men." Now, the rest of the conversation is, in deference to the audience, is censored because I advised him in no uncertain way that he was going to take the sheet down, or he would be wearing it in a very embarrassing way. And And the other officers agreed with me, but I became, in a sense, a spokesman. And that was my first introduction to the wonderful world of the United States of America in 1942 in the South. And in spite of the fact that I trained and was able to develop a company that passed its overseas shipment tests, and it was the only company in this black training regiment that did. And this is very important, 28. We did some great things. We were a cohesive unit. And at that time, I and some other white officers were leaning on the War Department and the representatives of the War Department for the purpose of having black officers assume commanding officer roles. Up to that point, a black officer in the United States Army could not command troops, black or white. They were always in the subordinate. They weren't considered qualified. So with heavy pressure, both within and out of the service, they finally changed the regulations, and the local commanders were advised to appoint black officers qualified to. So who do you think the first white officer relieved to be replaced by a black officer? It was me. And as my first sergeant said, you can fight him, Lieutenant, and he says, but you can't beat him. And he says that the Army's too big. He was regular Army. And it broke his heart. And a lot of the men who had gotten to know me and respected me wrote to me afterwards, and the outfit slowly went down the drain. And the last I had heard was Smitty, my first sergeant, was a corporal in an outfit in England. And the company commander was a white officer that I knew from Camp Sybert. And he said Smitty was doing very well, and like a lot of the other of your men, they all miss you. Well, at that point, I was kind of floating around, went out to Dugway Proving Grounds, and then finally came back to Edgewood Arsenal for a battalion officers school. And that was an interesting situation, which doesn't bear upon the history.
And I'm gonna have to
But
ask,
while I was there, then I got orders to report to Pine Camp.
and I'm just gonna have to ask you as we move forward,
Yeah.
just to tighten up a little bit,
Yeah.
because I don't wanna relive, I don't wanna be here till midnight, I don't wanna keep you here till midnight.
Yeah.
I'm gonna slip through real quickly.
Okay, Bob, thank you. It's great to see
All right,
you, man.
it's nice meeting you. Nice to meet you.
Mm.
Thank you so much.
As a smoke officer, at that point in time, the thought was that they would use the deceptive qualities of smoke, area smoke, along with sonic, to enhance the sonic operation. So I was sent up to Pine Camp to serve. I met Colonel Raley under an extraordinary figure. I mean, I had not been terribly impressed with the senior officers in the United States Army while I was in the South, but this guy had style, he had grace, and he was certainly a leader. And I can remember so well his greeting to me was that, Lieutenant, he said, the mission of your company will be to draw enemy fire. So I said, that's rather interesting. what he actually meant, but it wouldn't have been as dramatic, was that we would, in a sense, draw enemy attention away from the real effort, and in effect, withdrawing the enemy fire. And I suggested that as a kid from New York and the Bronx, I said, I certainly respect the role that we have to play, but I reserve the right to kick a little ass myself if I get the opportunity. And he roared. He says, "I love that." He says, we hit it off right away, and then he after a little while, I don't know how long, it was a very short period of time, the Braley and the rest of his staff agreed that they weren't going to use a smoke as a corollary, and that if it was ever needed, there was enough smoke operations in the Army to serve the purpose and could be called upon. But it was suggested that the 31st sonic units, highly secret, should be protected, cloaks in, and my platoon was then designated for reconnaissance and security.
So you're protecting the guys who are doing the sonic deception.
Yeah.
And as you were in France, when you're in France doing this, there must have been times, and you've told me about times when you kind of rubbed up against other people, other units nearby, some interesting stories about people thinking that there's a real armored division there or something's going on.
Well, it was classical. At that particular point in time, there had been enough publicity about dummy tanks, and the GIs were pretty much aware of deception. They were not aware that there had actually, for the first time in the history of the United States Army, or maybe any army, a unit organized as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops would, for the specific purpose of tactical deception. That was their mission. And sonic, for all of us, I know certainly for myself, I had heard a little about wire recording, but I never dreamt that this could be incorporated into a combat arm, and the people we worked with were astounded. I know one classical moment was during an operation along the Moselle River, and we had a screen of cavalry, and I believe it was the 5th Cavalry that they were involved in sort of a jumping match with the infantry. They would cross and get a bridgehead across the Moselle. The infantry would then come in and take the position. The Germans would push the infantry outfit, which was relatively inexperienced, push them out, and the cavalry would come back and push them. And we would be in there to tactically deceive and make, because we were the Moselle in Luxembourg was very thinly held, and much to our regret later on with the bulge. But they had certain the 12th Army Group had X number of men, X number of divisions, and they were deployed for the best strategic manner that they deemed, appropriate. Well, in any event, this one particular night we're playing a concert, as we would refer to it, and I was on. We had a perimeter between us, then the cavalry, and then the river and the Germans. And all of a sudden, storming up the road. This guy looked like a monster because he had a flak jacket on, and there were hand grenades hanging, and carrying a Thompson submachine gun. And after we stopped him, sign, countersign, and the usual recognition, and he says, "Lieutenant, yes, sir. What the hell's going on here, son?" I said, "Well, what do you mean, Colonel?" He says, "Well, what are them tanks doing here?" I said, "Well, there aren't really any tanks." "Well, some expletives suitable to the occasion." And he said, the gist of it was, "Don't tell me, I know what I hear. There are tanks out there, and nobody told me there was going to be a tank." So I said, "Well, it's wasn't intended, but this is what's going on, And I explained to him about the Sonic vehicles and what they were doing and why. And as it developed, he had been away at the briefing, and his aide, who had been to the briefing, had been called away before he had a chance to report fully to the colonel. And it was too often the occasion. A lot of the ground people did not take deception seriously, so he wasn't told. So his parting words was, "Well, son," he says, "you certainly could have fooled me." And I told him, "I'm sorry, it was not our intention." So,
Our intention's to fool you, but we're definitely trying to fool the guys on the other side of it.
well, that's obvious. That's what it was for. And then, of course, there were other moments not as benign. Out at Brest, one of our first operations, we did a very successful sonic imitation of the assembling of tanks, and for some reason or other, the commanding officer of this tank battalion sends his tanks right down the ravine that we had played for dummies' sake. And the Germans, in response to what we did, overloaded that area with 88s. And before the tanks got almost past what they call a line of departure, 5 or 6 tanks were blown out. And it was a serious error, but there was a lack of coordination on a higher level, and unfortunately, a lot of ground officers, armored infantry, so on, did not take tactical deception seriously. But as time went on, they began to, and then they began to ask for us. And we had to prove our mettle. We had to train and, in a limited period of time, equip, develop the tactical capabilities, and then convince our own people.
Didn't have a manual for this, did you?
No manual, no training manual, no table of organization. We played it by ear. We example, I came up with a list of what I felt was necessary for my platoon for security's sake. And one of the big items was get bazookas, because the most serious threat would be armored vehicles. See? And I remember we didn't get the bazookas actually until we were overseas. We never got them in the States. But I remember Colonel Rayleigh on the phone, calling this general commanding a regional supply depot, and it was very interesting.
A heated phone call?
Pardon?
A heated phone call?
He had the phone tapped. He tells the general that this conversation is being recorded, And I could hear the general on the other end of the phone say, "What the hell does that mean?" He never heard of recording a telephone call. This is 1944, 43.
And this equipment that you're using for these deceptions, I mean, this must have been, I mean, obviously it's state of the art for the time, right? These trucks and the recorders and everything. Can you
Well,
tell me
you
a
know,
little bit about that?
we had working with us up in Pine Camp. We had this civilian corps of experts in sound from Bell Laboratories, the big automotive company that made truck bodies and all. We had special mounts and cradles for the sound equipment, and really, and his staff organized Pine Camp, the Army Experimental Station, very carefully, and called upon, and utilized the advice of people who had been previously involved, like Doug Fairbanks Jr. in the Navy, and of course the civilian people who were specialists in sound, like Bell Laboratories and others. So we had a kind of an interesting. It wasn't as off the hook, so to speak, as you would think. It was really conceptually organized very well, but we didn't have that much time. And then all of this information had to be filtered down. And I think Lieutenant Manza and the sonic people did a hell of a job. I mean,
The guy who recorded the sound?
yes, and they were brilliant. I'm going to tell you, as often as I be out there between them and the bad guys, and I'd be listening to that sound, that's as often as after a while my eyes were beginning to tell me what my ears were hearing, and I began to see tanks. And it was it was absolutely psychologically, it was the most unnerving thing. I would actually begin to see in the dark, see tanks.
They weren't there.
They weren't there. They were in my ear, but they weren't. It was an extraordinary experience. And of course, as we went along, we rapidly got better at it. I mean, getting in, getting out, positioning ourselves effectively, and then of course the recordings were brilliant. I mean, if the tanks had if there was a road leading up, tanks had to be, the music had to be described. The change of gears, tanks going up, tanks going down, tanks assembling, and background noise of men, shouting commands, and it was quite an operation, and the I think that made most of us most proud after a while was that we took it from zero, and we turned it into something, and we did it ourselves. Yeah, I mean, without the help of others, but we organized it and coalesced it and brought it to fruition. And most of our operations, the people we worked with said they were convinced that we did accomplish what our mission called for, to make them believe there was something going on that wasn't.
Well, it seems
So as a sort of I was noted for my frivolity at times. I used to refer to us as the Cecil B. DeMille Warriors.
Can I ask you to say that again? Just,
Pardon?
can I ask you to actually tell me again what you just told me? Can I ask you to say it again?
Well,
Just the last sentence about the Cecil B. DeMille.
well,
Clear your throat in the middle, so I just want
I used to refer to our 31st, 32nd, and the rest of the 23rd headquarters as the Cecil B. DeMille Warriors.
You're out there, you're putting on a show.
Yeah, we put on a damn good show, though. I mean, we, at the very end, the last major operation, the crossing of the Rhine River, we received a letter of commendation from the commanding general of the Corps, Simpson, thanking us for our role in contributing to the success of the operation at Virsan. We covered, in a coordinated effort with other units, the movement into position of a corps. Now, a corps represents almost 200,000 men. Now, you're talking about 3,000 men, and there's some additional troops covering the movement of a corps, and the results were evident when the real operation took place. There were only 17 casualties. The crossing of a river under combat conditions unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. And some of the naysayers said, well, the Germans were the last. There was still a lot of fight left in them. And the reality was their maps showed the elements of the Corps in locations where we wanted them to believe. The cover plan called for, and not the actual locations in which the crossing took place.
So it seems to you definitely that was a big success.
Oh, not only to me. I mean, what the hell, I was a lousy platoon leader. Not lousy, pretty good one. But, I mean, to a lot of the staff officers and guys up, I can remember, as an aside, I had a friend who, after the war was over, and it was, I think it was after the Korean War, he went to City College to finish his education in sociology, and he took ROTC while he was there. And frankly, he took it because you got paid a couple of bucks, for like reserve officer training. And he had heard me talk about what I did during the war. And while we had some thought about top secret, actually, I don't recall to the same extent that John Walker did that they laid it on that heavy. At any event, in the manual that he had, it wasn't classified. There was no confidential stamp on it, or a top or secret stamp. There was the story of the crossing of the Rhine as an example of combat deception, and he mentioned to his instructors that his friends actually served in the army that was in the organization that was involved in the operation. And wouldn't it be great if he came and he talked to the reserve officers about what happened on the ground? So I got up and I went there one afternoon, and I told them about it. And, nobody said, hey, this is really top secret. I really believe what happened, there was so much classification, and so the Army was so big, and then it was suddenly condensed that, there was things that happened that were just passed by or forgotten until Enderlein and some of the others went down to Washington and finally got I got the story declassified.
You're satisfied.
So, so that, we became legitimately able to talk about
Mission. Now you also got into. You talked about how you learned as you went along, and you got better as you went along. And one of the things that you did as you went along is you guys started doing more of what they call the special effects.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, early on, it became apparent that in order to reasonably conceal the movement of a real regiment or division, they had to remove their bumper markings on their vehicles, which indicated the organization they belonged to, and the patches, shoulder patches, which inevitably, show the headquarters or the organization they were with. So our people, and Bob Conrad can tell you that Fred Fox was instrumental, along with a few others, particularly the design people in the 603rd, that another good way is one thing to take off the dummy, the real markings, but what happened to them? I mean, did they just disappear? So make them come alive now on the dummy. So we began to put on their patches and put their bumper markings on, and we physically assumed the role. Only for every 100 of them, there might be 10 of us. So in order to demonstrate to the world at large that there was a actual unit involved, what we did, and one of the ways intelligence was able to determine the strength or the activity or the intention of a unit in the field was by the vehicular traffic. And we had the Jeeps and half-tracks and command cars racing around. And again, we were play acting. And we would go to, if there was a town nearby, we would go into the town, and we'd find out if like a division or a special unit had a particular song that they liked to sing. We get blitzed and sing their song. Might just as well sing their song as somebody else's. So it became, you could say it was somewhat theatrical. We were, and again, we were improvising this. And of course, there was drawbacks to this. I don't know if anybody ever told you this story.
I don't know what story you're going to tell me.
But when we were in Luxembourg, there was an officers club at the 12th Army Group headquarters.
I'm just going to, would you just hang for 1 second, Dick?
Yeah.
Before you start, Mr. I know we've already have a lot of stuff inside. So you were just telling me about something that happened in Luxembourg Officers Club, I think.
Yeah, well, we were at a briefing of the 12th Army Group Special Troops operation, and I passed by this officer who I had seen on several different occasions, who I got to know pretty well, and you know, in passing, you know, and so at the club, he came over to me. He said, "Dick," he says, "you're with the 83rd Infantry Division now?" That was the patch of the day for us. He says, "Weren't you with 5th Armored there? And if I'm not mistaken, in England, you were with another outfit, the 23rd." So I said, "Well, you know, I hate to admit it," I said, "but I've been fouling up quite a bit. So I mean, I guess they're looking to get rid of me, you know, pushing me around." So he said, "Well, you better watch yourself, you know." He says, "You know, I'll be to bust you down and put a rifle in your hand and make an infantryman." I said, "Well," I said, "that probably wouldn't be the worst thing that could happen, you know." So that kind of talk. But this was very interesting. Here was a guy who suddenly caught on to the fact that in 5 or 6 months, I had been in 3 different outfits.
And where did that happen?
Pardon?
Where was it that you ran into him?
That was in the Officers Club in 12th Army Group in Luxembourg.
I'm going to take you back and ask you to describe again. I wish I could play you the tape, but I'm not going to do that. But just tell me again about this deception mission. And I know, about the special effects. And we got the part where you're talking about how people used to take the bumper markings off when they're moving and hiding. And now you guys are adding a new wrinkle to this. Pick it up.
Well, it was one thing to have a unit that was moving into a tactical situation to remove all signs of their origin or identity, and so as to cover their tracks. But the question then was asked, well, where did they go? So somebody had to take their place. And what happened was that we recognized that what we would do is while they removed their shoulder patches and their bumper markings on their vehicles, we would adopt their shoulder patches and their bumper markings. And then now the dummy became the real, and the real disappeared. See? So that this little development became an intrinsic part of our operation. So in any given 2 or 3 weeks, we might have been 3 or 4 different organizations, you know, and it was crucial, for example, in the Virsan operation that we established that the 2 infantry divisions were not where they were going to be to make the crossing, but where we wanted the Germans to think they were, which was 35 miles to the south.
So what are you driving around? What are you doing
Oh,
to carry this?
everything. Driving around, hanging a washout on the line, sound at night, radio. Some of the we would take over the radio nets, and it was enormously successful because the Germans would be eavesdropping naturally on the radio, and our people were so skilled at imitating the operators for the people we were taking over, you might say. And so the combination of all of the factors, again, is the Cecil B. DeMille storyline. I mean, you know, the guy had to have the right uniform. He couldn't come and play an Egyptian warrior, you know, with wearing blue jeans. So we had to totally take over the role of the people we were trying to screen, cover. And
what was your song? You were talking about a song, and again, it was just the siren. You were talking about going so far as to the bars, I guess, or going to the cafe and sing somebody else's song.
Oh, yeah,
What
well,
did you tell me?
that was, we pulled that off once in a town that had a going bar, you know, it was very rare, but it wasn't that close actually to the front, to the line. But at any event, there were a lot of civilians, and we knew that the chances were that there were always what would they call line crossers, and they were eavesdropping. You know, that old admonition: seal your lips, and save the ship. Or that. So one of the gags we came up with, this division we were emulating, making believe, they had a popular song. So this night we were in this bar, we got a little blitz, and we're all singing the song, like the songs of the division. I'm sure that any guy that was there taking notes, you know, about what the Americanas are up to, you know, the First Infantry Division, they must be here, you know. So, you know, again, what we were doing, we were leaving tidbits of information, here, there, and what happens is that it was, you know, you corroborate radio, okay, physical evidence, sounds, people walking around, the vehicles, you know. So it all added up. By God, there they are, the 35th and the 79th, or whatever, you know, they're up there, and that's where it's going to be, right on, bang, on the map. Well, really, they were not there, they were down here. And it worked. And the guys we worked with who were in on the secret, so to speak, they really marveled at it. They thought, you know, they knew certainly at the beginning, we had the Germans outclassed completely, outmanned. I was in from Normandy to the end. I don't think I saw 2 German planes in all that time. But when the GIs found out what we were up to, particularly the Sonic, they loved it because we weren't just, you know, beating them by bull strength. We were, pardon the expression, screwing them too.
And you guys were really, you were innovating all the time.
What?
You were innovating all the time.
You know, it's true. I mean, we were in and out of so many operations. I think that formally 28 separate, not just the 31st, 32nd, but the operations of the member units of the 23rd headquarters. Sometimes in concert together, you know, with the engineers or the signal people and so on. But we were always like Peck's Bad Boys. We were always up to something.
And tell me about, before I let you go, tell me about Bob Conrad a little bit, since I know you guys were friends at the time and you talked to Bob. But
Well, Bob was, you know, as he said, he was the message center officer, so he knew everything that was going on. I mean, he was privy to all the organization's messages. And he was also he was interested in the law. And after the war was over here in New York, he went to law school and became a very credible attorney. And we had a kid in my outfit, and how he ever got in, I'll never know. But he was something of a mechanic, and something happened to him. He went over the edge, and all of a sudden he disappeared. He went AWOL. what had happened was when we had reached Paris, the infantry, 20th, I think it was 28th Infantry Division, marched through and out, and we were stopped at Saint-Germain-du-Pré, which is right outside of Paris, at the École de Militaire, I remember that. And some of us, we weren't supposed to, because there were still snipers and things going on in Paris. But we were sneaking in. And this kid, this soldier, met a Parisian girl. As boy meets girl, they developed a serious attachment. So much so that when we left and headed out toward Metz, he disappeared. After a while, we had to carry him AWOL, absent without leave. See? About two weeks or more later, he shows up. And, what the hell's going on? She didn't want me to go. It was almost pathetic. So 23rd Headquarters had heard about it because the reports go up through headquarters. And the commanding officer was not the nicest of people. And of course, we had a guy who was absent without leave during wartime. So he called for a court-martial. And Bob Conrad defended the guy. And as I remember correctly, he did a very, very credible job and was able to get the guy off with practically minimum punishment. So that's how I got to know Bob. We became pretty good friends. We were both New Yorkers. He had a great sense of humor. He was charmed by our operation. We took a liking toward each other, and we remained friendly. And after the war was over, did a lot more serious drinking than was.
I heard you did some during the war too.
Huh?
I said I heard there might have been some during the war as well.
Yeah.
But
Oh yeah. Well, one of the famous stories is the story of Cognac Hill. I don't know if any of the other guys have ever told you anything about it.
I want to hear your version.
But during the march from Saint-Germain, south of Paris, and heading toward Metz, all of a sudden we're stopped. No gasoline. And the gas depots, had no gas to give us. At that point in time, all the gasoline that was available was going to the Allied operation at the huge airborne assault against the Rhine bridges at Nijmegen. They made a movie out of it, A Bridge Too Far. So we were stuck. Here we are. And about 2 days or 3 days sitting there, we get word there's a gas depot. 40 miles up the road is opened up. Send your trucks up. So we send our 2.5 tons trucks up, to get gas, with the jerry cans and the next day the trucks come back. They ain't got no gas. They're loaded to the gunnels with Cointreau, Calvados, brandy, man, you name it. They came across, I guess you'd call it a distillery or and there was nobody there, and guys were helping themselves. We had 500-gallon wooden cask of Moselle wine that we used to use instead of water. because, water you had to purify it with lousy chlorine tablets and all, and it tasted like, as the GIs would say, everything tasted like shit. And so that was called Cognac Hill. Kids, I know some in my outfit who never drank that, but anything more than 7 and 7. 7 and 7 was the drink of the day in the United States Army for the young GI. That was Seagram 7 and 7 Up. To this day, it nauseates me. But that's another story.
We need to,
No, I also want to let you know, 6:30.
So that was our contribution to the unsuccessful effort at Nijmegen, Cognac Hill. It's a lighter touch, and it's, the war wasn't always grim, and for some reason or other, what you do is remember the lighter things, and not the mud and the cold. And that was then, but the lighter touches. This story you'll like.
I'm rolling, we're ready.
Are you ready?
Yes, come.
As you may know, we were, after the war, the shooting had stopped, and while we were getting organized to come back, the 12th Army Group had us doing guard duty, or we were running DP camps for the Army, and we had a camp in Ida Oberstein, and I was the security officer, so we had 6,000 Russians, 2,000 Poles, Italians, Czechs. These were all forced labor for the Germans in the Alsace. They didn't come from camps like Auschwitz, but these were labor camps, and they were relatively in decent condition because they were working the farms. The Alsace is a big farm area for Germany and France, and without them, they would have nothing to eat. Any event, so what we had was 2 meals a day for the adults, and UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation, had milk and cheese and eggs for children. But the adults, everything went into this huge cauldron, this huge pot, and 2 soups a day. Okay. And one day, my first Sergeant Beaver, who was our mess sergeant, he said, "Lieutenant," he says, "maybe you ought to look into this. Something funny is going on." I said, "What?" He says, "The Russians are fighting with the Poles. They want to do KP duty." I said, "What do you mean they want to do it?" "Yeah," he said, they're battling. They want to work in the kitchen. I can't figure it out." I said, "Well, let's see what the hell's going on." So as it develops, after a little investigating, the Russians wanted to do KP duty so they could peel the potatoes. Now, they weren't stealing the potatoes. What they were doing was taking these peelings and making instant vodka out of it. And I realized that one of the reasons the people in the camp seemed to be getting along so well together, everybody was happy, but they were all blitzed on 24-hour vodka. And,
Hey, one thing, you mentioned this briefly. You didn't mention by name, but you talked about the commanding officer, Colonel Reeder.
Yeah.
And I have talked to many veterans of this unit and have yet to hear anyone who seemed very fond of Colonel Reeder. It seems like he was not very happy that he was there.
Well, that's probably, see, for a civilian officer, I knew whence I come and where I was going. The military, as a professional, the way to advance is to command a combat unit in the field. If you want to become a general, you better become a battalion or regimental commander before you make it as a division commander and you're a general. So the only way to get there is in combat. And Reeder, I think, resented the fact that he was with this this group of actors. He was not a very happy guy, and while we were in the field, and not too pleasant, or in this cold barracks during the bulge and all, where he and his staff was at the Italian legation in Luxembourg, and we were pulling guard duty for him. The difference between him and Colonel Raleigh, for example, was night and day. Raleigh, the men came first. Their comfort and welfare, and they responded. I mean, there was a big difference. And it was one of the... Ritter represented the old caste system in the Army. Raleigh represented the new attitude. And Raleigh was an incredibly intelligent human being. He had a great background. Little is known of the fact that he was called upon by the War Department and the Secretary of War to do a study of the United States Army before the war started, and because the draftees, after their year was up, they were talking about over the hill in October, and the morale was. So he developed out of his study of what was going on. He was working for the New York Times, and he developed a program called Why We Fight. And his recommendation, top secret, went to President Roosevelt, General Marshall, Leslie McNair, Secretary of War Stimson, and I think he kept a copy, and the publisher of the Times, 6 copies. And, it was phenomenally important, the morale of the Army before Pearl Harbor was down the tube.
We just have a couple of minutes of tape left, and I think we're just about done. And I'll just ask you any final reflections as you look back 60-plus years ago on those events.
About what?
As
Final
we finish up, any
reflection.
final reflections looking back at the, watch your head.
Yeah.
Allow the shot? Yeah. You okay?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question.
I'm upset anytime you are.
I think in a final reflection, I had many recalls, but I think, interestingly enough, when I read Brokaw's book, that coupled with a book by Ambrose about the citizen soldier, I put that together, and I realized that given the proper motivation, the American citizen will serve the country well. And we came up in a time of great peril, and we produced, we trained, and remember, we were not professional. A professional army was not that big. but we had outstanding leaders where they had to be. Marshall, Bradley, McNair, some great people. And I think putting it all together and giving them a reason, a real reason. The American can be trained to defend his country like no one else. And this I believe. And the mistakes we made in Vietnam, we made in Iraq, was that we were looking to do something that we were not either trained for or psychologically prepared for. And it was a tremendous error in both cases. And all we're doing today is compounding it, and in compounding it, we're making our country look bad in the eyes of the rest of the world. So that's in reflection. In further reflection, let me say, I look back with great pride on the role I played with the 31st, 32nd, and particularly the memories of serving with a great bunch of young men in the 4th Platoon. For that, I'm really proud. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.